I was sitting on a plastic chair outside the US consulate in Puerto Vallarta, watching the security guard check his watch for the third time. My debit card had been declined again. The ATM screen kept flashing insufficient funds in English and Spanish, like it was mocking me in two languages. I had exactly 43 pesos in my wallet. Not enough for a taxi back to town. Definitely not enough for a plane ticket home. The woman behind the bulletproof glass had already told me twice that they couldn't help with repatriation unless I could prove I was indigent. Apparently, owning a cell phone disqualified me from being officially broke. I stared at the phone in my hand, the last thing connecting me to my old life, and wondered how long before I'd have to sell it just to eat. 18 months earlier, I stepped off a plane here with $220,000 and what I thought was love. My name is Robert, and I'm 62 years old. I used to own a small accounting firm in Omaha, Nebraska, had the same office for 23 years, same coffee shop every morning, same routine that kept me sane after Linda died. Cancer took her when she was 58, and I spent the next 4 years just existing. Work, home, sleep, repeat. My kids lived in different states, busy with their own families. I understood that. I'd raised them to be independent, but independence and loneliness aren't the same thing. And by 61, I was tired of eating dinner alone every night, tired of talking to the TV, tired of going to bed in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. That's when I downloaded the dating app. Not Tinder, something called International Connections, specifically for people seeking relationships across borders. I told myself I was just curious, just browsing. Valeria's profile caught my attention immediately. 31 years old, living in Puerto Vallarta. Her photos showed her at different restaurants around the city, always smiling, always elegant. She worked in tourism, spoke perfect English, and her messages were thoughtful, asking real questions about my life, my work, my dreams. We talked for 3 months before I even considered visiting. She never asked for money, never mentioned financial problems, just genuine conversation about books, travel, what we wanted from life. Our conversations had depth that I hadn't experienced in years. She'd ask about my favorite clients from the accounting firm, remember details about stories I'd told her weeks earlier. When I mentioned Linda's death, she didn't offer empty condolences or try to change the subject. She asked thoughtful questions about what our marriage had been like, what I missed most, how I'd found the strength to keep going. It felt like talking to someone who actually saw me as a person, not just a widower counting down to retirement. When I finally booked a 2-week trip to Puerto Vallarta, she insisted on showing me the real city, not just the tourist areas. She picked me up at the airport in a modest Honda, took me to family-run restaurants, introduced me to her circle of friends who worked in hotels and tour companies. Everyone was welcoming, curious about my life in Nebraska, but never intrusive. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The weather was perfect, the food was incredible, and Valeria made me feel like I was interesting again, like I had stories worth telling. We spent long evenings walking along the beach, talking about everything except the obvious question hanging between us. What was this? Where was it going? On my last night, she finally brought it up. Robert, I know you have to go back tomorrow, but I want you to know these 2 weeks have been special for me. You're different from other men I've met. More serious. More stable. She paused, looking out at the ocean. I've been thinking about opening my own restaurant. I know the market here, I have connections, but I don't have the capital. Maybe when you retire, we could explore this together. Not just the business, everything. I flew back to Omaha with my head spinning. The grey winter felt even greyer after 2 weeks of sunshine. My office felt smaller. My house felt emptier. I found myself calculating constantly. My firm was worth maybe $180,000 if I found the right buyer. My house could sell for $240,000 in the current market. Linda's life insurance had left me with $150,000 in savings. After taxes and expenses, I'd have enough to start over somewhere warm, maybe even help someone I cared about build something meaningful. The decision made itself over the next 6 months. I listed the firm, found a buyer by spring, put the house on the market in May. By September, I was liquidating everything, transferring money to accounts I could access internationally, applying for a temporary resident visa for Mexico. Valeria was supportive throughout the process, helping me understand the paperwork, the requirements, the cultural adjustments I'd need to make. Don't worry about the restaurant right away, she told me during one of our video calls. First, just come and settle in, learn the rhythm of the city. Then we can explore the business opportunity together. Her patience impressed me. She wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding immediate investment. She seemed to understand that this was a big life change for me. I arrived in Puerto Vallarta on October 15th with $220,000 in accessible funds and genuine excitement about starting over. Valeria had found me a furnished apartment in Zona Romantica, walking distance to the beach, $800 a month. The rent seemed reasonable, the location was perfect, and having her help navigate the lease in Spanish made everything easier. Those first few months were everything I'd hoped for. I woke up to sunshine every morning, walked to the same cafe where the owner remembered my order, spent afternoons exploring the city or reading on the beach. Valeria and I fell into an easy routine. Dinner twice a week, weekend trips to nearby towns, quiet evenings at my apartment where she'd cook traditional Mexican dishes and I'd tell her stories about my boring life in Nebraska. The restaurant conversation came up naturally after I'd been there about 4 months. We were walking through the Marina district, and Valeria pointed to a small space with Sorrento signs in the windows. This would be perfect, she said. Good foot traffic from the hotels, but not tourist trap pricing. Local families would come here too. She'd clearly been thinking about this for a while. Over the next few weeks, she showed me business plans she'd been developing, market research about the local dining scene, even preliminary sketches of how the space could be laid out. The numbers looked reasonable. Initial investment of $75,000 for lease, equipment, permits, and 6 months of operating expenses. She had connections with local suppliers, experience with the permit process through her tourism work, and ideas for marketing to both locals and visitors. Her research was impressive. She'd identified peak dining hours, analyzed competitive pricing, even calculated optimal staffing levels for different seasons. The concept was sophisticated, upscale casual dining that bridged Mexican and international cuisine, targeting both tourists seeking authentic experiences and locals wanting quality food at fair prices. She showed me photos of similar successful restaurants in Playa del Carmen and Tulum, explained how Puerto Vallarta's market was underserved in this specific niche. We would be equal partners, she explained one evening over dinner. You provide the capital, I provide the local expertise and daily management. We split the profits 50-50 once we're profitable. I'm not asking you to just give me money, Robert. I'm asking you to invest in our future together. The word "our" hit me harder than it should have. I'd been alone for so long that the idea of having a real partnership, in business and in life, felt like a lifeline I hadn't realized I was drowning without. I transferred $75,000 to a Mexican business account Valeria had set up through her contacts. She handled the paperwork, the permits, the negotiations with the landlord. My Spanish was improving, but legal documents and business regulations were still beyond my comprehension. I trusted her expertise, and everything seemed to be moving smoothly. The first red flag should have been how quickly the money disappeared. Within 3 weeks, Valeria explained that permit fees had been higher than expected. Equipment costs had increased due to supply chain issues, and the landlord had required additional deposits for utilities and insurance. We needed another $30,000 to stay on schedule for our planned opening in March. I know this is more than we discussed, she said, showing me revised budget spreadsheets. But this is how business works in Mexico. There are always unexpected costs, especially for foreigners. The important thing is we're making real progress. Looking back, there were other signs I chose to ignore. She'd become evasive when I asked for receipts from specific purchases. Her explanations for delays changed depending on when I asked. The contractors she mentioned were never available when I wanted to meet them, always busy on other projects or away for family emergencies. When I suggested visiting the equipment suppliers directly, she discouraged it, saying my presence might complicate negotiations or that the suppliers preferred working through local intermediaries. I wanted to believe her, because I wanted the restaurant to succeed, because I wanted us to succeed. I transferred another $30,000, telling myself that $105,000 was still within my comfort zone, still left me with enough money to live comfortably while the business developed. But March came and went with no opening. Valeria had explanations: health department delays, problems with the electrical inspection, issues with the liquor license that would take another month to resolve. Each delay came with additional costs. Another $5,000 here, $8,000 there. By May, I'd invested $125,000 in a restaurant that existed only on paper and in Valeria's detailed explanations. That's when I started asking harder questions. I wanted to see the actual permits, visit the space during renovation hours, meet with the contractors directly. Valeria became defensive. Robert, you don't understand how things work here. The permits are being processed. The contractors don't speak English. You're making this more complicated by not trusting the system. But I insisted. I'd built a business myself. I knew that legitimate investments had paper trails, that real contractors had schedules, that actual permits had reference numbers you could verify. When I finally saw the restaurant space in June, it was empty. No equipment, no renovation, no signs that anyone had been working there at all. The landlord looked confused when I introduced myself as the investor. He spoke enough English to make it clear that no rent had been paid, no lease had been signed, and the space was still available if I was interested. The permits Valeria had shown me were photocopies of applications, not approvals. The equipment invoices were estimates, not purchases. $125,000 was gone. Not invested, not delayed, gone. I confronted Valeria that night, and she broke down immediately, crying, apologizing, explaining that her family had been in crisis, her father's medical bills, her brother's business failing, her mother's surgery. She'd used the money to help them, intending to pay it back once the restaurant was profitable, but everything had spiraled out of control. I never meant to hurt you, Robert. I care about you. The business plan was real. I just needed to help my family first, and I thought I could manage both, but I was wrong. Give me time. I'll pay you back. I promise. The tears seemed genuine, but the explanation made no sense. If she'd needed money for family emergencies, why create an elaborate fake business instead of just asking for help? Why involve fake permits and fake contractors and fake equipment purchases? Over the next few days, I discovered the scope of what had happened. The business account she'd set up was in her name only. I had no legal claim to any funds. The transfers I'd made were classified as personal gifts under Mexican banking law. Even if I could prove fraud, which would be difficult, recovering the money would require years of legal proceedings with no guarantee of success. But worse than the money was what came next. In July, I developed chest pains that sent me to the hospital. Nothing serious, just stress-related anxiety, but the medical bills were substantial. My US health insurance didn't cover treatment in Mexico, and I'd neglected to purchase international coverage. The hospital bill was $18,000 for 3 days of tests and observation. I called Valeria, hoping she'd at least visit, maybe help translate with the medical staff. Her phone was disconnected. I went to her apartment. The neighbors said she'd moved out suddenly, left no forwarding address. Her social media profiles were deactivated. She'd disappeared as completely as the restaurant money. Sitting in that hospital bed, trying to figure out how to pay an $18,000 bill with my remaining funds rapidly depleting, I realized how completely I'd been isolated. The friends I'd met through Valeria were actually her friends, and they were no longer returning my calls. The city I'd found so welcoming suddenly felt foreign and indifferent. I was a 62-year-old man with no local connections, limited Spanish, and rapidly disappearing resources. The nurses were kind but professional. They spoke enough English to explain procedures, but couldn't offer the comfort of genuine conversation. I lay there for 3 days, staring at the ceiling, doing mental calculations. Every hour in that bed was costing money I didn't have. Every test, every medication, every meal was pushing me closer to complete financial ruin. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd come to Mexico for a more affordable lifestyle, and now I was facing medical bills that would have been partially covered by insurance back home. The hospital wouldn't discharge me until the bill was paid. I maxed out my credit cards, emptied my remaining savings, and walked out owing another $3,000 that I promised to pay within 30 days. My total accessible funds were down to about $15,000. Not enough to live on indefinitely. Not enough to start over again somewhere else. Barely enough to survive until I figured out what to do next. My temporary resident visa was expiring in October. Renewal required proof of income or substantial Mexican bank deposits. I had neither. My US Social Security wouldn't begin for another 3 years. The small pension from my accounting firm wouldn't be enough to meet Mexican residency requirements, and definitely not enough to live on comfortably. I spent August and September in a cheap hostel, trying to figure out my options. Going back to Nebraska meant admitting complete failure. I had no house, no business, no life waiting for me there. But staying in Mexico meant facing deportation when my visa expired, living as an undocumented resident with no legal protections and no way to access services. The hostel was filled with young backpackers who saw Mexico as an adventure, a gap year experience, a story to tell back home. They had energy, optimism, and safety nets I'd given up decades ago. I became the quiet older man in the corner, the one who ate instant noodles for dinner while they planned beach trips and nightclub adventures. The manager was sympathetic but clear. This was a business, not a charity. When payments stopped, residents left. No exceptions. I applied for jobs online, but who wants to hire a 62-year-old American with limited Spanish and no local work authorization? I contacted distant relatives, former clients, anyone who might remember me fondly enough to wire emergency funds. Most didn't respond. Those who did offered sympathy but no concrete help. The decision was made for me in early October. The hostel manager informed me that my credit card payment had been declined. I'd reached my credit limits, my bank accounts were empty, and I had nowhere to go. I spent 2 nights sleeping in the bus station before swallowing my pride and walking to the US consulate. That's where I found myself on that October morning, sitting on a plastic chair, watching my phone battery die, trying to figure out how to explain to the consular officer that I needed help getting home to a country where I had nothing left. The process took 6 hours. Forms, interviews, verification calls to distant relatives who could confirm my identity and citizenship. The consulate could provide a repatriation loan, but it would cover only the flight to my last US address, and I'd have to repay the government once I was back on American soil. They couldn't help with housing, food, or starting over. That was my responsibility. The consular officer was professional but firm. This wasn't their first case like mine, and it wouldn't be their last. They'd seen American retirees stranded throughout Mexico, victims of romance scams, failed business ventures, medical emergencies, simple miscalculation of living costs. The process existed because the problem was common enough to require systematic solutions. I signed documents promising to repay the loan, provided contact information for relatives who could vouch for my identity, and waited while they arranged the cheapest available flight to Omaha. I landed in Omaha on a grey October afternoon with $47 in my pocket and a government debt of $1,200. The city looked smaller than I remembered. The weather felt colder. Everything I'd built over 23 years was gone, and I was starting over at 62 with less than I'd had when I graduated college. 6 months later, I'm working part-time at a tax preparation service, living in a studio apartment that costs more than my entire monthly budget used to be in Puerto Vallarta. I'm slowly paying back the government loan, slowly rebuilding credit, slowly accepting that this is my life now. Not the comfortable retirement I'd planned, not the romantic adventure I'd imagined, just survival, one day at a time. The tax preparation work is seasonal, barely enough to cover basic expenses. My boss is understanding about my situation without prying into details. My co-workers are mostly college students and retirees looking to supplement Social Security. We're all starting over in different ways, all pretending that working at 62 feels like a choice rather than a necessity. The routine helps. Clock in, process returns, clock out. Simple problems with clear solutions. No complex emotions or cultural barriers, just numbers that either add up or don't. The hardest part isn't the money, it's the quiet. I spent 18 months in a place where people talked to each other, where strangers smiled on the street, where life felt vibrant and connected. Now I'm back in a world of schedules and routines and polite distance, working alongside people young enough to be my children, all of us pretending that starting over at this age is normal. I still think about Puerto Vallarta sometimes. Not about Valeria, not about the money I lost, but about those first few months when everything seemed possible. The sunrise over the bay, the warmth of people who didn't know my story, the feeling that maybe finally I'd found where I belonged. I don't hate Mexico. I don't hate Valeria. I don't even hate myself most days. But I understand now that desperation makes you vulnerable in ways you can't see until it's too late. Loneliness makes you trust people you should question, and the desire to start over somewhere new can blind you to the reality that some problems follow you wherever you go. The clock is ticking for all of us, but sometimes the scariest thing isn't running out of time. It's realizing you've wasted the time you had left.